yourselves into groups of 2 or 3 people. These are called buzz groups, and start talking about yourselves. I don't, I'm going to stay back here, and if you need help, ask me. But I'm going to stay back, and you guys discuss for 5 or 10 minutes. So after that, we get to a discussion in class. Typically, the result is that there's much more participation after the buzz groups than if you didn't do the buzz groups. And the reason for that is because the students have a way to, first of all, try out their ideas with their peers, not in front of the professor, and not in front of the whole class, but just of a couple of people. And they figure out how that sounds, and what kind of response they get from their peers, and then become more confident. So you have to teach that sort of becoming more confident in expressing your ideas. The upshot of all of this is that it does require a lot of work on the part of the teacher, because first of all, it works only in small classrooms, where therefore there's a much better ratio of student to teacher. What that means is that unless all of a sudden we get flooded with funding in higher and lower education, what that means is that individual teachers have to teach more classes, so it's more work. But more importantly, facilitating a discussion is not easy, because you have to know quite a bit about the background material, much more than just what is in the textbook, because the students might go in the directions that are completely unexpected.
Right.
You can't stop them and say, well, no, I'm sorry, I haven't read about that, and so let's talk about it later. Mm-hmm. They might go in directions that are way outside of the initial boundaries, and that means that the teacher really has to spend a lot more prep time before getting to class. In class, it doesn't say much, but before class, it's much more work. So most teachers just don't do it.
How does this apply to a lab?
Even better.
Really?
Even better, because what a lab turns into to be is what is called an open-ended lab, as opposed to a lab exercise. So most of the times, labs work this way. There's an assignment, doing an experiment with a predetermined result. Often enough, the result doesn't come out right, because the students made a mistake somewhere in between, or because the materials were not exactly right, and so on and so forth. Typically what happens is that the teacher says, okay, forget about it. Here's what you should have gotten. Write the response based on the expected results, which teaches exactly the wrong way about science, right? About the wrong message about science, because it tells you, well, so it's all predetermined, and it doesn't matter what I do. We already know what's happening. What the teacher should say instead is, okay, so the experiment didn't turn out the way we were expecting it. Why? What sort of hypotheses can you formulate that might explain the new result, and what sort of follow-up experiments might you want to do next week to sort of test your hypothesis? Because that is the way science works. When I got into an experiment with one of my graduate students about something and we don't know the outcome, I don't have the answer ahead of time. That's exactly what we do. We do an experiment based on certain hypotheses. It turns out that the results are different from what we expected. We think about it and we try to figure out 2 or 3 different alternative hypotheses for why that happened, and then we build new experiments to follow up and figure out which one of those hypotheses is correct. So this open inquiry method is really what teaches how science works, but we don't do it most of the time. It's very expensive, again, because it requires small classrooms, and it requires a lot of preparation and background knowledge on the part of the teacher.
We only have 3 minutes left. These have been wonderful, wonderful programs. You're a scientist. I have such high regard for scientists. Our society doesn't in so many ways. We use everything that are the products of science, our medicines, our pharmaceuticals, our electronics, everything. But we give science, and I mean, don't you just love being a scientist?
I do, but on the other hand, there are really interesting reasons, actually, for why science does not... Science, as you say, there's this ambivalence. Science does have a good reputation in the United States. It's scientists who don't have it.
Yeah.
And part of the reason it's our own fault. We tend to be really, the stereotype of the aloof scientist who is, in the ivory tower and doesn't want to, is not very social and so on and so forth. Well, a lot of my colleagues do fit into that stereotype, so it's not.
And how many of them are atheists?
Many. Many. But part of it is that there is also a more fundamentally, I think, there is a very well documented history of anti-intellectualism in the United States. There is a distrust of intellectual pursuits in general. This has been very well documented by social scientists. It has been with the United States basically from its beginning. And that is actually a much more deep-rooted reason why science in particular and intellectual activities in general are not as well regarded, despite the fact that we do enjoy the results.
Do they
We
know
sh-
any reason for that?
Yes, think about what started this country. A small minority of intellectuals influenced by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution who came up with the Constitution, right? The American Constitution is probably the best embodiment of the Enlightenment philosophy. And then a bunch of other people with very little education and who were very fundamentalist religious, who came here because they were escaping religious persecution. That, from the beginning, created this huge dichotomy between an intelligentsia of a small number of people that were pursuing intellectual activities, and a lot of other people who distrusted that sort of thing because they saw it as a way of manipulating power and so on.
Well, yeah, and the believer has to destroy the scientist because the science destroys the theology. So they have to attack it.
There's that.
I just think that if we paid scientists what we pay professional sports players,
Oh, I have a favorite anecdote about that, actually. There is an
30 seconds. Can you do it in 30
There's an
seconds?
interesting story. Yes, a physicist won the Nobel Prize at the University of Colorado a few years ago. He was given the opportunity to answer questions from journalists, and the president of the university was next to him. And a journalist says, "Professor, you have this opportunity. The president of the university is next to you. What would you like?" He says, "I want to be paid this much as the football coach." And the president laughed and said, "Come on now."
That's true.
Thank you very much for watching The Atheist Viewpoint.